Good evening, everybody, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day. And for those of you who know where you descend from, happy Indigenous Peoples Day to you. I descend from Taino Indians. My great-great-grandmother was a Taino Indian, so this day especially is quite important to me. So I mean, Columbus was cool because he gave us like a day off from school and work and stuff like that, but that's it. He didn't do anything else good for us. The story I'm telling tonight is about one of the most important men in my life, and that's my dad. My dad was a transport from the Bronx. He came up at the age of 19, I want to say, and developed a career at Crossroads Incorporated, but it's now defunct. My dad was the clinical services director for that facility, which worked to rehabilitate drug addicts and alcoholics, and also rehabilitate drug dealers and families, all families affected by this epidemic, which is still going strong, unfortunately. My dad was a very serious man. He had very serious goals and very serious expectations. But the one thing that softened him was music. My dad was a lifelong music lover, and his love of music was passed on to me and to my sister. And so here's the story. It was a cold February night when my flight from England touched down at JFK. I'd returned home to grieve with my family due to the very recent loss of my dad. And by the time that I had hit home at 3 a.m., I had 3 years worth of luggage to unpack, which I finally did, into my childhood bedroom, and was so tired that I passed out. And later on in the day when I awoke, I started the process of unpacking and organizing my new life into my old life. And part of that process included clearing away more than 30 years worth of vinyl that my dad left behind when he died. Stacking up the records, or beginning the process of stacking up the records, I got distracted by one record sleeve. All black record sleeve, nothing really, shiny or important about it, except for this circular pumpkin orange sticker that was attached to the plastic protecting it. And on that were letters and numbers stamped to it. And those things together said, special, $4.99, Cutlers. I really don't know when it was in our weekend excursions to the Broadway in New Haven or to Cutler's record shop that my dad told me this, but I found out that I started going to Cutler's with my dad at only 6 months old. And so the lovely people who worked at Cutler's watched me grow from a baby into an adult. And it was at Cutler's that I bought my first records in life, 245s, Madonna, Who's That Girl? I was a big Madonna fan. And La Bamba by Richie Valens. Also, it was at Cutler's that my dad was able to create a good rapport with the DJs that worked there. So when you entered the store, they had a section towards the back called the DJ booth, and there they had all these bins that you could pick out your records from. My dad would do that, and he'd pick out like a really huge stack, and then go to the booth, and the DJ on hand for the day would play him the records, and then he'd go and buy the records that he thought sounded the best to him. And I got to cut my teeth on music knowledge, dance music knowledge, actually. speaking to the DJ and watching my dad speak to the DJ, and with that good rapport came, perks. My dad often received special promos that came from halfway around the world. First prints and releases, mixtapes from DJs, it's all in the vibe of networking. And when I got older and I was able to go and pick up my dad's weekly stack of records, I also created a good rapport with the DJs. And by then there were some well-known local and more well-known DJs that would come through to Cutler's, and they'd see this chubby 15, 16-year-old kid saying, no, not that record, play that one again. No, speed along, put it to this part here. And sometimes I'd be challenged by these DJs, and unfortunately for the DJs, they'd have to walk back to the front with the stacks of their records with their tails between their legs, because I may have been a kid, but I was a kid who knew a lot. So in the record booth, we would have and pick up all of our records and take them home. And then the next day, very early in the morning, my dad would wake me up, and the next step was to make the fresh mix compilation. So right up until the late 90s, going on 2000, was when my dad used tapes. So the Maxell tapes, the TDK tapes, and he taught me how to load them into the tape deck, which side was for recording, which side was for playback, which buttons to press, the levels on the volume. And he did a pretty good job of teaching me how to do it, because it was only after about the third or fourth try that I had to do it every single time we made a mixed compilation. And then for Christmas, 1999 going into 2000, my mom gifted him a CD recorder. And so my dad's eyes were starting to get a little bit bad. He had to wear glasses, and so he's like, no, Jez, you read the manual, you hook it up, I trust you. And so that's how it was. With the sets, we would do the mix and then go upstairs, get dressed, head out for the day, and have that mix set blaring from the car stereo. And it was one of the best feelings. It was annoying to the neighbors, but for me, it was one of the best feelings. Something else that was quite magical about my dad was that he would somehow conceptualize a theme or a movie plot line or some sort of story, maybe a made-for-TV movie. He was very into his movies as well, and so the mixed compilations would be the soundtrack to whatever that concept was. And that's really one of the first places where I learned to tell stories, albeit set to music. And so just the magic of that, and now being able to credit him as one of my first storytelling teachers really is something else. But anyway, I'm back to stacking records in my childhood bedroom. And my mom comes into the room and she sees that I'm working, so she decides to give me a hand. And once again, I'm distracted by another record sleeve, special $4.99 Cutler's. And she gives me this look and walks over to me. And then she hugs me. We both embrace each other. And she says to me, baby, I know it's really hard. And I nod, and we set back to work, stacking up the records, making space for my things. And somehow in that process, we get to talking. And my mom and I are picking up these records, and it's almost as though the memories are like printed on the record sleeves, because they're just kind of like soaking their way into our hands and up into our minds and out of our mouths. And so my mom started to tell me stories about my dad. These were stories that he had told me before, but just reminders of, even though he's physically gone, he's always still with us. And she reminded me of him being a little boy. And as I said, he grew up in the Bronx. And he was one of four. And so dinner time, where it could have been a rather raucous event, was dead silent, because both of my grandparents, especially my grandfather, who is to this day the proudest Puerto Rican man you will ever meet, demanded that that entire table sat and ate in silence. Well, when the second man of the family arrived, he wouldn't eat his dinner unless the radio was playing. And so it was that that change occurred, and my grandfather had to relent, and he had to let my dad be able to eat his dinner while the AM radio was playing, and so made everyone happy. And she reminded me of one of the funnier memories where my dad, in his teenage years, going on late teenage years, was able to get a job, a part-time job at the Wiz. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the Wiz, it was like an electronics and music shop. And so in the basement of the building where he worked, there was a record section. And he worked at the DJ booth. But initially, they wouldn't get too many customers because none of the customers know what the records sound like, so how are you going to buy a record if you don't know what it sounds like? So he somehow managed to convince the manager to let him start messing around with the records, and he'd do that, and then more customers would go down to the basement than they would spend on the ground floor or the first floor. And so that's where my dad cut his teeth and learned how to mix records. And back in that time, disco was big, so it must not have been that hard to learn how to mix. At any rate, his pay allowed him a growing record collection, and he managed to get a mixer and a prized strobe light. And one night, after work, he decided to put on his own disco in my grandparents' living room. And he invited my mom, and my aunts were there, and he's playing records, he's mixing records, and he's got his strobe light blinking, but it was one of those types of strobe lights that was like portable, so it had like a strap where you could detach on one end, you hang it up on something high enough so that it blinks all over the room, and then you secure it again, and then you play the music. So where he hung it from was this macrame hanging plant thing that was hanging from the ceiling in the apartment. So he did his best to attach it to there, and it's hanging and it's blinking, and he's playing the music real loud, and everyone's having a good time. So my grandmother walks in, and she decides she's going to join them, and she goes and she has a seat. But the seat she takes is right underneath the strobe light, which is hanging from the macrame plant pot holder. And the music's going, and they're all having a good time, and all of a sudden, the strobe light detaches itself and falls smack on my grandmother's head. The music stopped. My father at the turntables, my mother and his sisters, my aunts, were watching in absolute horror as my grandmother grabbed the strobe light that had hit her, and she's sitting with it, and they're watching to see what she's going to do. Maybe it's just an accident, we all laugh it off and turn the music back on. No. My grandmother gets up from the seat where she is sitting. She's holding the strobe light, walks over to the living room window, and chucks the strobe light out of the window, which, mind you, is still blinking. And so this strobe light falls 7 floors down, blinking all the way down to the ground. Lands with a thud, like that Wile E. Coyote cartoon. And so the next day, my father and his sisters head out to see if they can save the strobe light. And the strobe light had landed with such a thud, it was like firmly attached to the green space in the yard of their tenement building. And so anybody walking by it who didn't know what was going on would be like, oh, nice trees. I didn't know strobe lights were growing out of the grass. Oh, okay then, and then just keep going. And so Eventually, he would go on to DJ private parties and events, and my grandparents would go, and nothing would fall on them, and everyone would have a good time. And, you know, back in the room again, stacking up the records, and we're remembering when I went off to England to study. And that was the first time that my dad was without his eldest child. I remember from an email I received from my sister, and let me know that he cried as he walked into the door. And my sister's there to greet him, and tears flowing down his eyes. He held his chest and says, "My heart hurts." And while I was in England, I was exposed to different other types of music. And so on my break home from the UK for Christmas, my dad wanted to know, he was frantic to know what I was listening to while I was in England. So I started to work right away. But I didn't have turntables. I didn't have vinyl of my own. What I had was a laptop and an iTunes account. And so the magical thing with iTunes is anything that would have been on vinyl at that time, you paid 99 cents and it downloaded straight to your computer. And then if you had a CD burner, you could make the CD from there. And so less than an hour later, I present my dad with his Christmas CD, which was so good, it was playing for more than a year after I had made it, which was the night that he passed away. But then that reminded me of the first hip-hop CD I had ever bought, which was Nas, It Was Written. And big fan of If I Ruled the World, so of course that was like constantly on repeat. And my dad was not a rap music fan. And as I said, he grew up listening to AM radio, and so then from there you had like whatever the teeny bopper music was, and then it was disco, and then house music from there. And I guess he really hoped that he would pass that along to us, but my sister and I had different tastes, and mine was Nas. So one night he knocks on the door, walks into the room, and his face is serious. It's like he's wearing a stone for a face. And he looks at me and he goes, "Jez, go put on that rap CD." And so I'm thinking, well, you don't like Nas or rap music in general, so maybe I should come up with like rationales as to why you should not listen to the CD. But none of that worked, and I relented and I put the CD on, fully recognizing that this probably would be the last time that I ever played my Nas album. What happened next, though, was a happy surprise, because my dad had me go and repeat tracks over and over and over again. That's how much he loved the CD. It unfortunately didn't turn him into a rap music fan, but I mean, Nas, good victory. When my dad died, the music stopped. There was silence. And, you know, in that silence, which at first felt so unbearable, I learned to speak again. Up until that point, I would drive by Cutler's, which was still open after he died and would stay open for about 3 more years. And I couldn't bring myself to walk into the store. I was scared. I was petrified. I just couldn't. But in the time that passed, learned to speak again, learned to talk about my father, to talk about his memories. And I learned to tell stories. But these stories aren't set to music. These stories are prompted by memories, by words, by pictures, by colors, by just walking outside and breathing in the fresh air. And so, even though the silence is a bit more bearable now, I know that my dad is always with me, and he's very proud that I'm able to tell stories. And that's it. That's my story. Thank you.
All right, so Jezrie is open to hearing some questions. So, thinking about this journey she just brought us on with her dad and music and disco to Nas, what would you like to know more about?
Yeah.
So what happened to all the vinyl records?
Okay, so the vinyl we still have, and I'm still living in my childhood bedroom, but it's nice and neatly stacked. Unfortunately, because of the way that some of it was stacked, they're so warped that they won't play again. But there are others, and I mean like super classics like Sarone's Supernature and Donna Summer Bad Girls. Like those are still in working order. So small victories, going for the small victories. But that's what happened to the records. We still have them. We still have them. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing up color. That's like, you don't even look like you did that when you hear that. Those colors and murals and a place on Nixon Avenue as well, Nixon Plaza, that is truly like loaded down with albums. And thank you for that memory.
Thank you. And you're welcome.
And the
Yeah, and the
Wiz,
Wiz.
for the New Yorkers.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Did you have a song, a particular song that you remember fondly listening to or singing with your dad?
There were a few. And I'm sorry, but I'm not singing for anyone tonight. So. But my dad had this one song that was one of his favorite songs to play until he found a new favorite song to play. And it was called Higher and Higher. And basically how the chorus goes is if you keep moving up higher and higher, things will work out fine. And the song itself was about picking yourself out of the doldrums. I mean, this person who wrote it was in the love doldrums, but my dad really loved songs like that, the pick yourself up and keep going type songs. He was really into that type of music. Yeah. Thanks.
Anything? Yeah.
What helped you rediscover your voice?
I'm sorry?
What helped you rediscover or utilize your voice?
Oh, thank you for that question. And a very good question. It would be the fairy tale ending to say, well, magically my voice just reappeared. I was so just like my grief was like a heavy rock I couldn't move. So I eventually had to go to therapy, and it was there that just the act of speaking, even if it was about nothing, helped to get the cobwebs out from my voice box. But what helped me really to rediscover my voice was going to the Institute Library Story Share. So I was looking for a way to express myself. And I don't know how many of you guys consider yourselves to be spiritual, but every now and again my dad sends me signs. He'll either do it through music, or there'll be butterflies, a type of bird. Mostly it's music. And I'm looking through, and a song that I hadn't heard in ages, in fact, a song that I hadn't even loaded up into my playlist started to play. And on the screen of my iPad was the story share for the Institute Library on Eventbrite. And so I took that as a sign that I should go, and I did. And thanks to Arnie and the wonderful members of that group, I was able to rediscover my voice and tell stories again. So, thanks.
I just have to say, hearing you say that, I remember you coming, and the first story I ever heard you working on was about your dad and his dying. And hearing this story today, I'm just so awed by how far you've come, how you were able to remember him, how positive it feels.
Yeah.
Me hearing it. So,
Thanks for that, Wendy. It has been a long journey. A lot of the stories that I tell mostly come from my past as a kid, because I've done a lot of cringeworthy stuff, and cringeworthy stuff makes good stories. But talking about my dad has always been something that I've kept very close to my chest. That's my process. But I don't know, just something about thinking about that this year in particular. He would have been 60 years old. So it felt like time. Like it was time to be able to share stories about my dad so that people who don't know him now get to know him the way that I did. And I'm really appreciative of that. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you so much. Please join me.